Rembrandt van Rijn started his artistic journey like so many others, but unlike them, he was able to see past the conformities of his time and create art that was not confined by society. What we know about him comes primarily from his famed collection of self-portraits, in which viewers can see his growth, aging, and development as an artist. By observing the evolution of his artistic styles and how they become rougher and darker with age, we begin to see that his seemingly triumphant life was, through the fortune and fame, marred by tragedy. The father of penetrating the human emotion, Rembrandt van Rijn was a renowned artist of his time. He was effortlessly able to explore and capture the depths of humanity in his paintings. Unlike many others, Rembrandt was able to express that people are thinking, feeling individuals through his artwork. This new way of analyzing people's emotions and their flaws would prove to be a revolutionary way of painting, but because of the strict artistic boundaries, it prompted Rembrandt to become the target of many idealist critics for the later portion of his life. At the time, Holland was just emerging from its Mannerism art era, which promoted idealization of subjects in art and depicted very little emotion in portraiture. Rembrandt, however, sought to add life to his portraits rather than diminish it, and although this defection led him to die in poverty, Rembrandt had unknowingly named himself one of the greatest artists in history. From an early age, Rembrandt begged his parents to send him to be an apprentice with master painters, most prominently the famed Pieter Lastman. For many years, he studied under him, developing a technique of chiaroscuro, which dramatized the lights and shadows he used, that crucially influenced his later work. However, as Rembrandt advanced, he quickly exceeded his teacher through technique. He quickly became famous and, after establishing a large studio in Amsterdam, attracted many pupils of his own. They emulated his styles, although many of them, such as Gerrit Dou, became increasingly popular by practicing standard art styles, including very fine details and vibrant colors. Rembrandt, however, continued to stray from those standards, and developed his famous techniques through his numerous self-portraits, in which viewers can, even today, see the physical and mental changes he went through. In one of his first self-portraits, Rembrandt paints himself whimsically, smiling and tilting his head back in a relaxed state. The colors in this portrait are still fairly bright and traditional for the time period, indicating that he had not yet developed his own style. The touches of bright pink on his cheeks and forehead imply that he is still a boy, untouched by the hardships of life. This was likely shown to emphasize his youth in a lighthearted sense. And after continuing to hone his skills and receiving hundreds of commissions, Rembrandt had reached the peak of his art career. Because of this, he often paints himself in lavish clothing, posing like wealthy aristocrats of the time. This portrait is one of the last before he begins to stray from the standard art techniques of the time. Rembrandt still executes his strokes smoothly and keeps his lines pristine. Although hints of his own style are beginning to emerge, he has still not fully developed them. The change between this and his next known portrait are incredibly evident, and although it was a tragedy that brought this evolution, in some ways Rembrandt had triumphed over the obstacle that many other artists of his time could not. The tragedy that changed his life was the death of his beloved wife Saskia van Eulenburg. She was his muse and his only female subject for the time they were married, and even after her death he refrained from painting the female subject for a long time. She had borne him a son, but his birth was compromised when Saskia died soon after. Following her death, Rembrandt fell into a period of grief. For over 7 years he didn't produce a single oil painting, much less a portrait. He went bankrupt and was eventually forced to sell his art and even the clothes off of his back. Though these misfortunes led him to a life of outcast and burden, they also increased his artistry. Rembrandt did not produce self-portraits during this time, but we can see through some of his studies, of beggars especially, that they resemble himself, as if he saw a piece of himself within them. It was then that he began to stray from societal constructs. The eye-opening experience of living in poverty allowed Rembrandt to experience life in the shoes of the common people. Instead of being above them, he became one of them. This resulted in his unusual preference to begin painting beggars rather than nobles, and action rather than stillness. In one of his most famous paintings, The Night Watch, he was commissioned to paint a group of nobles and gentlemen of rank. He was expected to paint a portrait like any others during the time, but instead he painted them in the middle of a dramatic, almost biblical scene, in which he added his unique muddy colors and drastic shadows. Although it is world-renowned today, the patrons were furious, and as the word spread of his absurd renditions, Rembrandt received less and less commissions, and eventually his name fell into oblivion. In the last years of his life, Rembrandt produced dozens of self-portraits. These are perhaps the most well-known, because the techniques and colors he used in them showed that he remained unbroken by the tragedies in his life, that, if anything, he had gained knowledge and artistry. Rembrandt showed that he was no longer afraid of depicting what he actually looked like. Instead of painting himself to be the wealthy and noble man he no longer was, Rembrandt allowed us to see into him, see the deepest, most imperfect parts of him.
It seems that he showed us how he looked. That he wasn't afraid of depicting himself with wrinkles and graying hair and a little bit of balding. He was not classically handsome, and he didn't shy away from showing us that. And there are, if you look at him, he grows old. He grows old, and he presents that for us to take what we will.
For instance, in this portrait, he stares unflinchingly at the viewer, having lived a life of success followed by failure. He is not afraid to show the heavy wrinkles between his eyebrows and the discolorations on his cheeks. He purposefully includes those to show that this was him in his purest form, and that he was proud. His eyes are steady, and yet there is a hint of genuine sadness, which he achieves only by truly accepting this form of himself. But with the rich pinks and other flesh tones in his face once again, Rembrandt seemed to be in an improved state of mind. He may have even been emulating a painting by Raphael, a famous classical painter he admired, thereby aligning himself with him and casting himself also as an esteemed painter, despite his tragedies. In another portrait done around the same time, he portrays himself wearing the robes and furs of a king, showing that he is still dignified and has self-respect. Yet in his face, we can still see the age and wear that only Rembrandt has been able to convey through his art, even hundreds of years later. Rembrandt van Rijn's life was not a spectacular one, but it was his art that made it special to viewers of his paintings. Through them, he told of the events that he went through, death, prosperity, and bankruptcy. But in the end, his legacy paved the way for hundreds of other artists after him who followed the same mindset and eventually shaped the modern art world. He teaches us through his self-portraits how to look at him, and even how to look at ourselves, with honesty and dignity. And by doing that, he has changed the entire ethical approach to art and portraiture. In a sense, Rembrandt's self-portraits achieve something far greater than merely being works of art. They teach us the things that happen throughout a lifetime, and by doing so, makes it possible for us to see the reflections of ourselves in his self-portraits, allowing each person who observes a Rembrandt to be fully in his presence even today.